I'm presenting to you the creative, sustainable, inclusive, and transformed real estate industry. We will cover a number of sessions in our presentation. We'll talk about the scope of the Property Sector Code. We'll talk about the changes and its implication, the gazetted amended Property Sector Code, all elements that actually impact on it, the importance of transformation, the real estate statistics, and lastly, the state of transformation of the real estate. On the 9th of June 2017, we gazetted the amended Property Sector Code. The new gazette came into effect from that time. What were the implications and the scope of the Property Sector Code? Starting with, just to give you an idea of basically what the scope covers. And when we talk about the scope, we said, who does it cover? To start with, it covers the commercial property sector, which includes the office space, industrial property industry, the retail property industry, and leisure property industry. Under the retail, we have houses and the housing scheme. We also have zoned land, and it has to be zoned, because if it's not zoned, it's either industrial or agricultural. We also have organs of state. So what are the elements that actually cover the property sector codes? There are 8 elements on the old property sector codes. That's ownership, management control, employment equity, skill development, preferential procurement, enterprise development, socio-economic development, and economic development. And that is the old property sector codes. In the new revised property sector codes, you then have only 5 codes. And that's basically all the ones that we've mentioned, but there's also a measure between the preferential procurement and enterprise development. Now, all of these 7 elements of the codes then start talking to actually what has actually changed. Now, looking at the 7 elements of the code, the question is, what is the weighting points of these 7 elements? As you can see, compared to the old code, the total weighting point is 117 versus 107 on the old codes. And on the right-hand side, you can see the ownership at 30, management control at 9, employment equity at 13, skill development at 19, enterprise and supply development at 39, socio-economic development at 2, and economic development at 5, the total adding up to 117. There's also classification of companies. What are those classification of companies? There's large, medium, and small enterprises. The medium enterprises, we call it qualifying small enterprises, and the abbreviation is QSE. And the exempted and micro enterprises, and those really represent the small industries. Under the real estate, only if you're above 35 million, then you are classified as a large entity. And for the medium entities or QSEs, when you are between 2.5 million and 35 million, then you are QSE, and less than 2.5, then you'll be an EME. Complex structure is the structure that applies in the property sector code that start to talk about which element would apply to which segment of the property sector. For the estate agents, we can see ownership would apply, management control, employment equity, skill development, enterprise and supply development, and socio-economic development, with economic development being taken out of the sector code for the real estate industry. Priority elements. There are 3 priority elements for the large entities, namely ownership, skill development, and enterprise and supply development. For each of these segments, you need to achieve the 40% minimum target. Under ownership, you need to achieve 40% under net equity value. Skill development, you need to achieve 40% of the total weighting points. Under enterprise and supply development, you need to achieve 40% of the total subcategory under enterprise and supply development. And those subcategories preferential procurement, supply development, and enterprise and supply development. Under the qualifying small enterprises, there are only 2 elements that you need to meet, of which compulsory would be the ownership. The other, which is skill development or enterprise, you can choose either or, but the total needs to be 2. If you do not achieve any of the 40% minimum threshold, you will be discounted 1 level down. What does that mean? If you are level 1 at the end of your verification, you'll become level 2. If you are level 2, you'll become level 3, and so it applies. The importance of transformation. There's a lot of rhetoric around economic transformation. Sometimes we don't even agree on the definition, because depending on the number of people that define what radical economic transformation, there's as many definitions as those that talk about it. But what is imperative and what we should be agreeing on is that our economy requires a transformation. And when we talk about transformation, it's about the growth of our economy, it's about the innovative of our economy, the sustainability of our economy, global competitiveness, as well as growth. In that growth, what are we talking about? We're talking about creating and driving inclusive participation, particularly in the mainstream of our economy, and including the previously disadvantaged to participate in the mainstream economy. And that is the majority. In this particular case, when you talk about the majority, we're driving the previously disadvantaged. In our real estate industry, we talk about how the practitioners' bill start to create that enabling environment for inclusive participation. And inclusive participation of the majority, taking for an example the South African demographics as it applies in the 2016-2018 demographics, where you see the majority of our South African demographics at 91%, and the white in the participant being at 8.9%. The picture itself starts to explain the reality of where we find ourselves in line with transformation, where equity applies in relation to equality, in relation to the reality. What are the elements that we talk to when we refer to transformation? The first element is ownership, management control, employment equity, skill development, enterprise and supply development, and socio-economic development. But we also have a unique element in the property sector that we refer to as economic development. How do all of these elements start to interact in order to transform our economy? You can see at the rock bottom of our slide where employment equity and socio-economic development starts talking to the second economy, which is really being able to create an enabling environment and removing the poverty barrier. And at the next level, you're talking about skill development, where skill development itself starts to break the skill barriers. This really starts talking to the professionals and the middle class of our economy, formal employed, the school leavers, the graduates, the artisans, the professionals, and a number of those that actually have got some tertiary background as well. But at the next level, we talk about business barriers, which is preferential procurement and enterprise development. Just really talk to people that are self-employed and also businesses that starts to participate in the space, either be small or medium or micro enterprises. At the highest brink of the transformation, we talk about ownership and management control. Ownership is obviously the people that actually have the economic interest and have got an asset-bearing level of ownership at that level. But management control also talk about people that have a strategic control and influence over the assets, mainly strategically through boards or executively through the entity as executive officers of the entity. What are the residential statistics as well? Well, firstly, let's look at basically where the residential fits in. Our total South African economy is at 5.8 trillion in total, really made up of the commercial entity at 1.3 trillion and broken down into the four sub-elements as we actually define them, with actually retail leading the commercial industry. But you also have the residential industry at 3.9 trillion, which is really made up of 6.1 million houses as we have it in the country as delivered. But we also have the informal industry sector that is not necessarily measured in terms of value, but in terms of volume, that's 543,000. The public sector made up of state enterprises at 66 billion, metros and selected municipalities, which are 15 of those at 69 billion, and also 102 billion rand of the public entities. We also have zoned land, which is 520 billion, which also only makes up the 1.1%. The research was important for us to actually be able to ascertain so that we can create a consolidated understanding of what the sector is all about. Prior to this research at 5.8 trillion, there was another research that actually revealed that the market at the time, which was 2012, was really at 4.9 trillion. And at the time, we did the research that started to talk about what is the South African economic impact to our South African economy, the property sector impact to the South African economy. And that impact was at 237 billion rand, which really started to talk about what do we contribute as the GDP of the industry and what do we contribute to the fiscus. And we used all of these entities to really measure what is the cycle of the property sector. So to the GDP, the property sector contributes 191 billion rand, and we contribute 46 billion rand to the fiscus. The State Agency Affairs Board, as a regulator, has registered 38,000 estate agents, of which 10 to 17 have been registered as black estate agents. This is tracking from 2012 all the way up to 2017. We also have registered over just 13,000 agencies, of which we've tracked from a period of 2012 between 2 to 6 black agencies in our Estate Agency Affairs Board records. And the trend starts to actually indicate and to also show us how we actually need to be able to create an intervention plan to close the gap and create an enabling environment where we can compete and we're able to have match the demographics of our country in that environment. We're also looking at the stats. We've been able to look at basically how the volume of our houses that we've transacted against in the country match those of our provincial estate agents. You can see that Gauteng, together with Western Cape and KZN, contribute 65% of the volume, whilst the value is about 75% of those 3 provinces. And the rest will actually be the balance of the 9 provinces that we have. So the 65 will actually also form part of the income group housing that we have in terms of volume, which is actually defined under the middle value income houses, low value, township, and also the unknown. On the other hand, on the value, you can see actually the flip chart, it flips completely. The majority of the 63% is made up of the super luxury houses, the luxury and the high value income houses. Now, what is the state of transformation that we've been able to report under 2016? Under the 2015-2016 report that have been submitted to the Property Sector Code, measuring particularly the ownership, management control, employment equity, skill development, enterprise and supplier development, and economic development, including our unique element, economic development. Measuring all of those, the Property Sector Code performed extremely well in the enterprise development and socio-economic development. Where we haven't performed so well, but have done reasonably well, is under ownership and particularly preferential procurement. And in the other elements, we then also have management control, employment equity, skill development, and economic development, where we still have a lot of effort to put. The industry itself has measured in the recognition scorecard as level 4. But that level 4, whilst it may be a reasonable performance, under the new recognition scorecard, it actually starts to become level 6. So for us to close the gap, we need to start putting more effort in order to get to the same level for the new recognition levels. Using the ownership scorecard, what do we measure when we use all of those elements? Under ownership, we measure voting rights, we measure economic interest, and realization points. And under each of those, you can see what we measure: the black voting rights, black women voting rights, economic interest of black people and black women, the black group schemes and the black new entrants, and the net equity value. Under management control, we measure voting rights and top management. Under employment equity, we measure black practitioners, black management, and also black administrators. Skill development, we measure the spend on black development, the spend of black disabled development, and also the black learnerships. Under preferential procurement, we measure the BEE recognized spend, qualifying small enterprises and EME spend, which is exempted micro enterprises, in a nutshell, medium and small enterprise spend, black-owned suppliers, black female-owned suppliers and spend, and black-owned property services. Under enterprise and supplier development, we measure the net equity value that is spent on an enterprise development contribution. And similarly, under socio-economic development, we measure the net profit after tax enterprises under socio-economic development. Economic development measures the investment in under-resourced areas, which really targets those areas where there's limited investment that's been put in those areas. So the question remains, are we there yet? We may not be there. We recognize a lot of work that needs to be done, but the road has been paved and it is very clear in terms of what we should be doing. So it's all up to us to put our effort, one agency at a time, to achieve the vibrant and dynamic transformed real estate industry. That brings me to the conclusion of the presentation. Please remember to answer the 10 multiple choice questions to obtain your 5 verifiable CPD points for the session.